What's up, biology students? Mr. Holloway here again. Today, we're going to learn about a class of organic molecules called the carbohydrates. But first, let's talk a little bit about what it means to be an organic molecule. Organic molecules are molecules based on the element carbon. In fact, there is a whole branch of chemistry that deals specifically with these kinds of molecules, and we call the chemistry of carbon-based molecules organic chemistry. Here on this slide, we can see some examples of a few different carbon-based or organic molecules. As you can see, carbon-based organic molecules come in many different shapes and sizes, and the ability to form molecules like these is exactly what makes carbon such a remarkable element. Carbon, like all atoms, is made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. The average atom of carbon has 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Although some carbon atoms may have 7 or even 8 neutrons, all carbon atoms have exactly 6 protons. That's what makes them carbon atoms and not something else, and this is why we give carbon the atomic number 6 on the periodic table. Carbon atoms also have 6 negatively charged electrons, one to balance out the charge of each positively charged proton in the nucleus. 2 of these electrons are found in the first energy level, as we can see in this picture, and the remaining 4 electrons are found in the second energy level. Probably sounds pretty boring so far, I'm sure, but it is these 4 electrons in the second energy level that make carbon atoms the basis for all life that we know of. See, these 4 little electrons allow carbon atoms to form as many as 4 covalent bonds with other atoms. And if some of those bonds are formed with other carbon atoms, each of which can also form up to 4 covalent bonds, then we can start to build some pretty large, pretty complex molecules. This hydrocarbon chain we see here, with the carbon in black and the hydrogen in white, is only the beginning. Here we see a few simple carbon compounds, some of which you may be familiar with. Methane, a form of octane, butadiene, one of those, acetylene, and benzene. Each little line you see represents a covalent bond, a pair of shared electrons holding these atoms together. 1 line means 1 shared pair of electrons, 2 lines means 2 shared pairs of electrons, and 3 lines means, you guessed it, 3 shared pairs of electrons. These are just some of the many carbon-based molecules that exist. And while they may be organic, according to the chemistry definition, they are definitely not safe to eat. However, the organic molecule that we're going to be talking about next is not only safe to eat, but is crucial for supporting life on Earth. There are 4 categories of organic macromolecules upon which all life depends, and these are the carbohydrates, the nucleic acids, the proteins, and the lipids. Organic means that all these kinds of molecules are made up largely of carbon atoms, just like methane and octane and benzene from the previous slide. And they are called macromolecules because they are bigger than a lot of other molecules. One reason these kinds of molecules are able to get so big is because they are made of many smaller molecules, building blocks that are similar enough that they can be linked together, kind of like Lego blocks can be combined to make bigger structures. These building blocks are called monomers, and the bigger molecules that are formed when they join together are called polymers. So, if you constructed a castle out of Lego blocks, each block would be like a monomer, and the finished castle would be a polymer, and we would call the process you use to put these blocks together polymerization. Carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids do numerous important jobs inside the cells that make up our body. And we get these molecules from the food that we eat, but not necessarily in the forms that our body needs. So our cells metabolize these molecules, meaning that we break them down and build them up into the appropriate shapes and structures that our cells need. Which brings us to the class of organic molecule we are going to learn about today, the carbohydrates. You're probably somewhat familiar with carbohydrates and where they come from, because they are a big part of many people's diet. Everything you eat that was once alive, whether it be plant or animal, contains at least some carbohydrates. But foods like grains, breads, pasta, rice, and potatoes contain very high concentrations of these organic macromolecules. The function of carbohydrates is primarily to provide and store short-term energy, and in some cases, especially in plants, to provide important cellular structure. Complex carbohydrates are made up of monomers called monosaccharides. Mono means one, and saccharide means sugar. So a monosaccharide literally means a single sugar. But more often we refer to them as simple sugars for the same reason. Some examples of monosaccharides are fructose, glucose, and galactose. You can see in this figure that each of these monosaccharides is made of a ring of carbon atoms and a few carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms sticking off the sides. This is why we call them carbohydrates. Carbo for carbon, and hydrates for water, which is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. These monosaccharides, or monomers, bond with other monosaccharides to form long chains. Polymers we call polysaccharides. We can see an example of this relationship between monomers and polymers in this picture of a starch molecule, which is a carbohydrate polymer made up of many glucose monomers put together in a long chain. Starch is just one kind of polysaccharide. Other polysaccharides, like cellulose and glycogen, are similar in that they are made of numerous monosaccharides bonded together in long chains, but as you can see, there are some differences in terms of how these monomers are put together to form that polymer, and these differences allow these molecules to perform different functions. Starch, for example, is a polysaccharide produced by plants in order to store energy-rich food molecules like glucose. Foods like potatoes, which are packed full of starch, are energy storage organs for a plant, and plants can access the glucose stored in these starch molecules to keep it alive during the cold winter months of the year. Long ago, humans discovered that we could dig up these storage organs out of the ground and eat them, taking advantage of that stored energy for ourselves. Cellulose is another polysaccharide produced by plants, but instead of using this polysaccharide to store energy, plants use cellulose to provide structure. Cellulose forms tough, rigid structures that help plants to support their weight against the pull of gravity. Cell walls, for example, are made of cellulose. Some animals, like cows and sheep, have multiple digestive organs to help them digest and metabolize cellulose, but we humans can't really consume cellulose in the same way. We think of cellulose in our diets as fiber, and mostly it just passes through us without providing much nutrition. It does, however, help to keep our digestive tract running smoothly. Since it doesn't break down in our gut, cellulose sort of acts like a broom for our intestines, cleaning out the pipes as it passes through us. In both cases, plants are able to build these polysaccharides because of their ability to do photosynthesis. When a plant does photosynthesis, it is using the sun's energy to transform carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water from the soil into glucose, a carbohydrate monomer, and oxygen gas, a byproduct of photosynthesis that happens to provide us with breathable air. The plant can then use these glucose molecules to provide itself with energy, or it can assemble them into starches in order to store the energy locked inside for later, or it can use them to build cellulose in order to grow bigger and taller. This is important because this is how carbon enters the food web, and without plants taking carbon from the atmosphere and using it to make carbohydrates, the food web as we know it wouldn't exist. When we eat a plant, we metabolize the starch, meaning that our bodies break it down into individual monosaccharides, which circulate through our blood as blood sugar. Our bodies use some of these monosaccharides right away in order to give us energy to fuel our cells. And when we have extra blood sugar, our bodies assemble these into larger molecules called glycogen, which is sort of like the animal version of starch. It's our way of storing these glucose molecules for later. Starch, however, is a long straight chain, while glycogen is highly branched, as we can see here. When our bodies need energy, we metabolize this glycogen in order to release more glucose monomers into the bloodstream. Glycogen is used for short-term energy storage only. When we have way too much blood sugar, more than we can use in the short term, then our bodies start to package these excess monosaccharides into molecules called lipids, specifically converting them into fats. A little fat is a good thing for our bodies because it provides protection, insulation, and padding. And the lipids that make up fat perform other important functions as well. But too much stored fats can lead to poor health. This is how overconsumption of carbohydrates, especially sweets high in sugar, can lead to weight gain. Since our body cannot use all the sugars floating around, it stores these molecules in the form of fat. So in animals, the primary function of carbohydrates is to provide and store energy. But how do carbohydrates provide us with energy when we need it? Remember when I said that plants use the sun's energy to manufacture carbohydrates from carbon dioxide and water? Well, when a plant engages in this process, called photosynthesis, it is as though it is packaging the sun's energy into that glucose molecule that it is producing. Living organisms, both plants and animals, use a process called cellular respiration to release this stored energy from glucose molecules. In the presence of oxygen, our bodies can break these glucose molecules down into their individual carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms, and then reassemble these atoms into carbon dioxide and water molecules. As these molecules are being built, the energy that the plant absorbed from the sun in order to make glucose in the first place is released into our cells and can be used to make ATP, the rechargeable battery of the cell. This is why we need to breathe oxygen, and it is also why we release carbon dioxide and water vapor every time we exhale. So in summary, simple carbohydrates are produced by plants during photosynthesis, and then are passed on to the rest of the food web. The monomers of a carbohydrate, like glucose, fructose, and galactose, are called monosaccharides. And these monomers join together to form more complex polymers called polysaccharides, like starch, cellulose, and glycogen. These carbohydrates are metabolized inside of our cells, meaning they are broken down and reassembled into a variety of forms that perform a variety of important functions. And the most important function of carbohydrates is to provide and store short-term energy, or, in the case of cellulose, to provide structure to a plant. And that is the deal with carbohydrates. Thanks for watching, everyone.